Welcome to Miss Scarlett, the place to be feminine. Subscribe and enjoy. The morning of Sarah's wedding day dawned with a heavy weight on Jonathan's heart. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind consumed by thoughts of the woman he loved and the impending nuptials that would forever take her away from him. The sunlight filtering through the curtains seemed to mock his somber mood, a cruel reminder of the joyous occasion he dreaded. Jonathan's apartment felt suffocatingly small as he paced back and forth, his bare feet padding against the worn carpet. He couldn't bear the thought of watching Sarah walk down the aisle, pledging her love and devotion to another man. The mere idea of it sent a searing pain through his chest, as if his heart were being ripped from his body. In a moment of desperation, a wild idea took root in Jonathan's mind. What if he could attend the wedding without anyone recognizing him? What if he could disguise himself and blend in with the other guests, stealing one last glimpse of Sarah before she became someone else's wife? The more Jonathan contemplated the plan, the more it consumed him. He rushed to his closet, rummaging through the hangers until he found the perfect disguise, a stunning, floor-length wedding dress he had once worn to a costume party. The ivory satin shimmered in the light, and the delicate lace bodice seemed to beckon him. With trembling hands, Jonathan slipped into the dress, feeling the cool fabric against his skin. He stood before the mirror, adjusting the straps and smoothing the skirt. The transformation was remarkable. He hardly recognized himself. A wig of long, chestnut curls completed the illusion, and with a touch of makeup, Jonathan became Jessica. For hours, Jonathan practiced his feminine mannerisms, perfecting the sway of his hips and the lilt of his voice. He studied YouTube tutorials on how to walk in heels, determined to blend in seamlessly with the other wedding guests. By the time he was ready to leave, the sun had begun its descent, casting an orange glow over the city. The wedding venue was a picturesque garden with rows of white chairs arranged before an archway adorned with fragrant flowers. Jonathan's heart raced as he mingled with the guests, his palms sweaty beneath the lace gloves. He scanned the crowd for Sarah, his breath catching in his throat when he finally spotted her. Sarah was a vision in her wedding gown, the delicate fabric clinging to her curves and flowing behind her like a river of silk. Her hair was swept up in an elegant updo, tendrils framing her face like wisps of spun gold. Jonathan's heart ached at the sight of her, so beautiful and radiant, yet so far out of reach. As the ceremony began, Jonathan found himself standing at the back of the crowd, his eyes fixed on Sarah. The vows were exchanged, and with each word, Jonathan felt a piece of his heart break. When the officiant pronounced Sarah and Michael husband and wife, Jonathan had to fight back the tears that threatened to spill down his cheeks. The reception was held in a grand ballroom with twinkling lights and flowing champagne. Jonathan watched from afar as Sarah and Michael shared their first dance, their eyes locked on each other, lost in their own world. The sight was too much to bear, and Jonathan slipped away to the balcony, desperate for air. He leaned against the railing, the cool night breeze caressing his face. Tears streamed freely now, smudging his carefully applied mascara. The sound of the door opening behind him startled Jonathan, and he turned to find Sarah standing there, her eyes wide with surprise. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," Sarah said softly, her voice like a melody to Jonathan's ears. "I just needed a moment away from the crowd." Jonathan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned back to the railing, hoping Sarah wouldn't recognize him beneath the layers of tulle and lace. But Sarah stepped closer, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Have we met before?" she asked, tilting her head to the side. There's something familiar about you." Jonathan's heart raced, his mind scrambling for a response. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. In that moment, he knew he couldn't lie to her, couldn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's me, Jonathan." Sarah's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jonathan, what are you doing here? And why are you cross-dressing? I knew you liked doing that, but why here?" Jonathan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confession that had been weighing on his heart for so long. "I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, Sarah. I love you, more than I've ever loved anyone. I know it's too late, but I had to see you one last time, even if it meant disguising myself to do it." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and she reached out to touch Jonathan's face, her fingers trembling. "Oh, Jonathan," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea you felt this way. I thought you only saw me as a friend." Jonathan shook his head, his own tears mingling with hers. "You've always been more than a friend to me, Sarah. You're the love of my life, the one I've always wanted to be with. But I was too afraid to tell you, too afraid of losing what we had." Sarah's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her body pressing against his. "I've always had feelings for you too, Jonathan, but I never thought you could love me the way I loved you. And now it's too late." Jonathan's heart shattered at her words, the reality of their situation crashing down around them. He knew he had no right to ask her to leave her new husband, to abandon the life she had chosen, but the thought of letting her go, of living without her, was more than he could bear. "It's never too late, Sarah," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "We can find a way. We can make this work. I love you, and I know you love me too. That's all that matters." Sarah's eyes searched his, a flicker of hope igniting in their depths. But before she could respond, the balcony door burst open, and Michael stepped outside, his face etched with confusion and anger. "Sarah, what's going on?" he demanded, his gaze darting between his new wife and the mysterious woman in the wedding dress. "Who is this?" Sarah's eyes widened in panic, and she stepped away from Jonathan, her hand flying to her chest. "Michael, I can explain." But before she could continue, Jonathan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest.
"It's me, Michael,"
he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins.
"It's Jonathan."
Michael's face contorted in shock, his eyes bulging as he took in the sight of his friend in a wedding dress. "Jonathan, what the hell are you doing here? And why are you dressed like that?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his gaze locked on Michael's. "I'm here because I love Sarah, Michael. I've always loved her, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her forever. I know it's wrong. I know I have no right to be here, but I had to tell her how I felt." Michael's face turned a deep shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides.
"You have some nerve, Jonathan,"
he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Showing up at my wedding, dressed like a woman, and confessing your love to my wife. How dare you?" Sarah stepped between them, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Michael, please, let's not do this here. We can talk about this later, in private." But Michael ignored her, his eyes still fixed on Jonathan. "You're pathetic. You know that?" He sneered, his lip curling in disgust. "Dressing up like a woman, trying to steal another man's wife. You're nothing but a freak." Jonathan flinched at the words, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He knew Michael was right, knew that what he had done was unforgivable, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it, not when it had brought him so close to Sarah, even if only for a moment.
I'm sorry, Michael,
he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper.
I never meant to hurt you, or to ruin your wedding day.
I couldn't keep living a lie, couldn't keep pretending that I didn't love Sarah with all my heart. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Jonathan's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I love you too, Jonathan, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I always have, and I always will. But I made a commitment to Michael, and I can't just walk away from that. Jonathan's heart sank, the weight of her words crushing his last glimmer of hope. He knew she was right, knew that he had no right to ask her to leave her husband, to abandon the life she had chosen. But the thought of living without her, of watching her build a life with someone else, was more than he could bear.
I understand,
he said, his voice breaking.
I won't ask you to choose, Sarah.
I know it's not fair, to you or to Michael, but I had to tell you how I felt. Had to let you know that you're the only one for me, even if we can never be together. Sarah's tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pulled Jonathan into a fierce hug, her face buried in the crook of his neck. I'm so sorry, Jonathan, she sobbed, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. I wish things could be different. Wish we could have had a chance to be together. But it's too late now. Too late for us. Jonathan held her close, his own tears mingling with hers. He breathed in the scent of her hair, the warmth of her skin, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, knowing it would be the last time he ever held her in his arms. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah's eyes were red and puffy, her makeup smeared across her face. But to Jonathan, she had never looked more beautiful, more perfect. He reached out to tuck a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek.
I'll always love you, Sarah,
he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. No matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, you'll always be the one for me. Sarah's lips trembled, and she leaned in to press a soft kiss to his cheek, her tears warm against his skin. I'll always love you too, Jonathan, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the music drifting up from the ballroom below. Always and forever. With one last lingering look, Sarah turned and walked away, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a river of silk. Jonathan watched her go, his heart breaking with every step she took. He knew he would never forget this moment, never forget the way she had looked at him, the way she had felt in his arms. As the balcony door closed behind her, Jonathan sank to his knees, the weight of his grief and regret crushing him like a physical force. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. He had lost her, lost the only woman he had ever loved, and he knew he would never be the same again. But even in the depths of his despair, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to regret what he had done. He had taken a chance, had risked everything to tell Sarah how he felt, and even though it hadn't ended the way he had hoped, he knew he would always cherish the memory of that moment, of the love they had shared, even if only for a fleeting instant. With a heavy heart, Jonathan rose to his feet, his wedding dress billowing around him in the cool night air. He took one last look at the twinkling lights of the ballroom, at the happy couples swaying on the dance floor, and he knew that he would never be one of them, never know the joy of holding Sarah in his arms as they danced the night away. But he also knew that he had to keep living, had to find a way to go on without her. He had to be strong, had to be brave, even in the face of his own heartbreak. And so, with a deep breath and a final lingering look at the place where he had lost everything, Jonathan turned and walked away, his heart heavy, but his head held high, ready to face whatever the future might bring. As he made his way back to his apartment, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment, even in the midst of his heartbreak. He had taken a risk, had put himself out there in a way he never had before, and even though it hadn't ended the way he had hoped, he knew that he had grown and changed in ways he never could have imagined. As Jonathan walked the quiet streets back to his apartment, the cool night air caressing his skin, he couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling that had settled in his chest. The pain of losing Sarah, of knowing that she would never be his, was almost too much to bear. But, even in the midst of his heartbreak, there was a glimmer of something else, a spark of excitement and possibility that he couldn't quite ignore. For the first time in his life, Jonathan had worn a dress in public, had stepped out into the world as the person he had always wanted to be. And even though the circumstances had been far from ideal, he couldn't deny the thrill that had coursed through his veins as he walked among the other guests, his skirt swishing around his legs, his wig brushing against his shoulders. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, a sense of freedom and authenticity that he had always longed for, but never quite achieved. And even though he knew that he would never be able to share that feeling with Sarah, he couldn't help but wonder if there might be something more out there for him, something beyond the confines of the life he had always known. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, his heels clicking against the concrete, Jonathan's mind raced with possibilities.
Maybe this was just the beginning, he thought. Maybe this was the start of a whole new chapter in his life. Maybe there were other people out there who would accept him for who he was, who would love him not in spite of his quirks and eccentricities, but because of them. The thought filled him with a sense of hope and excitement, even as the pain of losing Sarah still throbbed in his chest. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a direction, a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. As he unlocked the door to his apartment, Jonathan couldn't help but smile, even through the tears that still clung to his lashes. He had taken a risk, had put himself out there in a way he never had before, and even though it hadn't ended the way he had hoped, he knew that he had gained something valuable in the process. He had gained a glimpse of the person he could be, of the life he could lead, if only he had the courage to embrace it.